In this video, we meet some of the conservation specialists who help us look after, maintain and preserve our churches. We discover how architects can help us and the role they can play. We also find out what's involved in a QI or quinquennial inspection and find out what they can be used for and how they can help. First, Paul Crosby explains more about the role of a conservation architect.
All architects deal with all types of architecture, but I think a conservation architect is somebody who has a real passion for historic buildings, not necessarily just repair, but it can be new build and alteration that can revitalise an old building or make it work better, or even just to recreate or correct imperfections in the past. As an architect, your tendency is to want to design, but within a historic environment, some people might be tempted to try and echo the historic language that they see around them. And I think that you should be able to have a confidence in new design, to sit contemporary design alongside an historic environment. It doesn't necessarily need to be a copy. It can be something which is the same scale and language, but it can be new materials, or it can be the traditional materials but set in a new way, which clearly shows that this is from 2000 and not part of the 17th century. So it's part of the evolution of the building. You're not trying to fake it, you're trying to enhance it.
In addition to the designs, there are other important considerations to factor in.
So anything which can be more community-based, that can tick boxes that will allow a wider range of granting to be accessed for the church. And there's a real skill that some PCCs have got and others just need a bit of help with to get them to be able to have the confidence to reach out to more grant aiding.
Some conservation architects are also SPAB scholars, which gives them additional expertise and training in the protection of ancient buildings.
Well, an SBAB scholar, they give out scholarship for 4 people every year. And the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings then encourages those 4 people to look at historic buildings, how they are to be repaired, and that can be based on an informed research into those buildings, but also can lead on to alterations or new build that might sit within that historic environment. And that's the side of things which really excites me, is how we can continue the evolution of these historic buildings, that they're not frozen in aspect, but that we carry on developing and evolving them.
Protecting some of our most important and ancient church buildings can seem like a huge undertaking, and it's important to know where to start, as Mike Darwell explains.
Well, the starting point for any, I suppose, conservation project on a building is to seek to retain maximum historic fabric. Change sometimes is necessary, but that always needs to be balanced. So minimal impact, and where there is change and there is impact, ideally that change needs to be reversible, so that in years to come, if somebody decides that what we're doing at this time isn't appropriate, it can be changed with the history, the historical integrity of the building retained.
So how can architects help those who care for church buildings with best practice?
Well, I think it's important for a specialist or a conservation architect to be involved, somebody who understands how traditional buildings, medieval buildings or old buildings generally, how their fabric works, and how you need to take time to consider what is an appropriate intervention, what change is appropriate, and what the long-term consequences will be of that change, because there will be consequences. And we need to make sure that we're considering the full range of options available. You need to know what those options are. You need to have an eye to cost. You need to have an eye to impact, and as well as the time that it's going to take to execute a particular repair. And you need to be able to advise PCCs as a client. You need to be able to advise them what the impact to the building is going to be in terms of the physical impact, but also the running of the building, the day-to-day change that they're going to have to experience while that work is carried out. Scaffold, noise, dust, debris, all the things that need to be contained. They need to be aware of that, and that's what the specialism of a conservation architect, somebody who's familiar with those processes, can bring to the table at an early stage. I think a really important part of that process is communication, is so that the PCC or whoever the representative, the church warden, the vicar, feels comfortable to come to talk to me, to email, to pick up a phone, as often as they possibly can, please, for my, is what I would say. Always talk to us, because if it's a two-way discussion, I know, I learn their train of thought and they understand my approach, and we make it a team effort. If we can bring everybody together to all have one common goal, which is the safeguarding of these buildings and what these buildings are used for, then that's to the benefit of everybody. And I think choosing a conservation architect, and we're lucky in Cumbria, we've got a lot of good conservation architects. The churches can be well served by that field of expertise, and if they're brought on board at as early a stage as possible, it's for the benefit of everybody.
Plenty of questions and good communication are important factors, and Reverend James Richards also has some good advice.
Best practice, get good advice and get it early. All Church of England churches have to appoint a church architect, and it's good to choose a church architect who will be able to work with your particular building. In our case, with a medieval building, we need someone with conservation experience and qualifications, which we're very lucky to have. What you don't want to be doing is sort of minor, what you think of as minor DIY repairs, without having thought very carefully. We can't just slap emulsion paint onto a bit of wall that's got untidy, because the untidiness may mask a different problem, and emulsion paint's probably not the right kind of paint. We can't just patch up a piece of wall with cement and so on, because it probably needs a lime mortar and not cement, and all that kind of thing. There are all sorts of things about old church buildings which are very different from the way modern buildings operate, and therefore what we know about modern buildings doesn't necessarily transfer to an old church building. Get good advice, get it early.
It might seem like a daunting task, but the impact can be huge.
I think the big impact is the continued life of the worshipping community being able to use this building for worship and witness. The challenge of having to do such a major project, and possibly another one following on, is that we get so absorbed by our custodianship of a Grade 1 listed building in a conservation area that we cease to be a community of God's people who are trying to live in love together and share that love with the wider world. And it's a real challenge for me and for all of us as a community that we go on holding on to that vision and recognising that the church is here, the church building is here for a purpose, not as an end in itself.
One of the processes an architect will go through with a church is called a QI, or a quinquennial inspection. So what exactly is one, and what's involved? Conservation architect Derbyl Keating explains.
So a quinquennial inspection is an inspection that is carried out by a church's inspecting architect every 5 years. It is a visual inspection of the church, both inside and outside, from the top of the tower right down to the rainwater gullies on the floor, and it's an assessment of condition. So you comment on the roof coverings, the rainwater goods, and the walls, the windows, all of the interior, right down to whether or not the fire extinguishers have been checked. Following that inspection, you compile the report, and each item is given a category from A to E, generally. So A being the most urgent, requiring attention within 12 months, and E being a desirable change. We also introduce maintenance items, so things like clearing leaves from a ground gully that is very easy for a church warden or a parishioner to carry out. Generally, we would meet the church warden or the vicar or whoever opened up the church for us, and we usually ask them to show us around the church, and just through the conversation they will mention things that are perhaps concerning them, but then we spend the day ourselves without distraction, looking at everything.
Morning, Devil.
Morning.
Morning, Mike.
Hi, Ian.
Good to see you.
You too, you too.
Yeah. Not a lot of problems, really. Have you seen the Swift boxes are there?
Oh yeah.
And we have a feeling that they are now in them.
Oh, very
Which
good.
is great. There's some more here.
Mhm.
But otherwise,
Gutters are looking good.
gutters are looking good. Yep.
Hoppers are clear.
Yep.
From what we can tell.
Yep. But we do need to get on with the windows.
Yeah.
Into the
Yeah,
jam.
that's right.
And there's still the same problem with that headstone.
Yes.
Something needs to be done.
Yeah.
Soon.
The wind took the surface of the top of the headstone off during
Yeah.
the winter.
Okay.
Just,
They've lost a bit around the top around here.
Yeah.
The wind's just got
Yeah.
at it and blown it down. Definitely need a picture of that one.
They've got all the bits though, so hopefully we can do something. But I think it's going to continue to deteriorate because you can see the delamination.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe go and have a look inside now.
It's also a good time for the church warden or property steward to discuss any concerns about the building they might have.
Okay, so you asked us to bring along these
Yeah.
plans from the works, Ian. So that was the overall one showing the elevations in the section
yeah.
and the plan of the church and what was done.
Well, you were saying something about an ongoing monitoring of the building.
Because we noticed this problem with the cracking in the render at high level when we had the scaffold in place for the roof work, we've installed some kind of structural monitoring devices, some telltales. So we're going to keep an eye on those over the course of the next quinquennium just to see if there's any movement, see if the building's holding itself in the position that it's at, and we'll bring the structural engineering on that as well.
Good.
So we now know what's involved and how they're carried out. Architect James Innerdale explains why they're so important and what happens after it's complete.
Quinquennial inspections are very useful documents. They are a record of the building at a particular point, but they're also helpful from the perspective of the church in that they have a record of what is needed to be carried out by way of maintenance. It can be simple maintenance work, but also it can be more significant repair schedules or structural issues depending on what the problems are, and it gives them a good starting point to know where to spend their funds and where to prioritise their work. When I've completed a quinquennial inspection, the usual process is to meet with the church warden on site and go around the building with the report and the recommendations of the report and go through those with him or her and explain what they are and have a discussion about them and how they might be prioritised going forward. There's a bit of vegetation, but generally speaking, in comparison to other churches, it's in pretty good nick. It's just the repointing, particularly along the edge of the plinth from where the wall hits the plinth, that gap.
Yes,
Water's going to be getting in there. But now we've also fixed the gutter when it's not dripping anymore.
Yes,
That's going to make quite a bit of difference.
And the rest of the pointing's in reasonable condition.
Yeah, this elevation, the pointing's in pretty good order. It's just on this elevation, it's just along a low level,
really. Doesn't get much weather, does it?
No.
It's mainly lime as well, isn't it?
Yes. Well, there's a mix. So you've got this is the earlier lime, and then obviously there's the sort of the greyer, darker areas of cement repair. But generally, yeah, I mean it's in good order. So that even might be the base coat for potentially when this was actually rendered. May have had a render on it before.
Could have been, do you think?
Could have been. We also perhaps need to think about whether or not I put it in the report, the idea whether to actually redecorate the rainwater goods or not.
Is that plastic running up the side there, or is that cast iron as well?
It's cast from the top of the tower down to the curve, and then it's plastic running down here and through to that hopper there. And this downpipe is also plastic as well. And I think I've picked up that in the QI. One of the points I make reference to looking at the possibility of redecorating and replacing plastic with cast iron at a suitable point. It's not a number one priority, but it's something that is worth considering.
Yeah. When everything else has been done.
One thing is certain, there'll always be plenty to do when it comes to the conservation and maintenance of these important buildings. But the end result will preserve a part of our community's history forever.
Well, I think one of the exciting things about being a conservation architect around churches is that you are part of history. So it really makes a difference. It's almost that a little bit of you is being immortalised in that repair or that alteration that lives on. So it's really, really important that you get it right, because this will, if you do get it right, will last for centuries.
To play a little part in that, to do a little something. And to be honest, most of the time visitors to that building won't know that we've carried out that change. They won't know it's happened. Just to do that, to take this building to its next phase of life, to give it another 100, 200, 300 years, is a really satisfying feeling.
It feels wonderful. You know, there are always fascinating buildings to be involved in. You learn so much during the process, and it's a real team effort from the contractors, from all the consultants involved, from everybody who works within the church, who are often doing so for no gain themselves. It's just for the love of that building within their community, and to see it finished and to see people coming into churches and enjoying them and appreciating them, not necessarily just for the fact that they are places of worship, but that they are places that have been community centres for centuries and centuries, and that's continuing. People are continuing to come into these buildings and appreciating them, and seeing all the beautiful works of art that are within them.
For more information, you can visit our website at www.ctfc.org.uk.